Hi, I'm Chris Wah. In this tutorial, I'll be demonstrating how to create a flickering neon text reveal using my masks to cropped layers script. The latest version of the script can be used for two different purposes. It can help animation, working with layers with masks, or it can improve performance by pre-composing. Now, in this tutorial, I'll be using the layers with masks options, and I'll leave the pre-comps for another day. Originally, this script was intended to work with masks that had been pasted from Illustrator, but in this tutorial I'll use After Effects text layers instead. However, the same approach will work just as well for any vector artwork that's been brought into After Effects as masks. There are three stages to creating this neon reveal effect. The first is to set up our artwork and then use the masks to cropped layers script. The second stage will be applying an expression that will actually create our flickering neon reveal. And then finally, in stage 3, I'll look at compositing the whole thing together. So, let's get started. Now the first step is to find a font that looks like neon lighting. For this tutorial, I'll be using a font called Roadhouse Neon. It was designed by Tony Thomas and I found it on the Media Loot website. Now, it looks like Tony has designed a whole set of neon fonts, and if you want to, you can buy the whole pack for only $19. Now, I'm going to admit that I actually prefer the look of the neon sign version. However, for this particular example, I'm going to stick with Roadhouse Neon, mainly because I'd already purchased it when a client chose it for a previous job, but also because it has twice as many lines for every letter, and it's going to be a really good case study for our expressions and later on our compositing. Now jumping into After Effects, and just jumping ahead a little bit, there are two other stock footage items that I'll also be using. Now the first is simply a brick wall image, and I found that again via Google, just on a free stock footage website. The other one is one of the atmosphere clips that came with Video Copilot's Actions Essentials. Now in this particular case, I've slowed the clip down by a third, and I've also pre-rendered it out to the size that we're working with for this tutorial. In this case, we're working at 1280 by 720, and I've just, as I said, I've pre-rendered the Atmos at that resolution. Now, my aim here is to create a project template that I can reuse anytime I want a flickering neon reveal. So I'm going to take care to keep my project clear and organized. That way, when I open up the project in the future, I'll be able to figure out what I've done, even if I don't remember actually doing it. There's going to be a number of steps involved to get to our final result, and so to help with that, I'm going to name my compositions accordingly. I'm actually going to name them like step 1 and step 2, etc. And this has the advantage of sorting them alphabetically in the project window, as well as giving me a visual reminder for the future of, what I've actually done. Right, so let's jump into this and get started. Okay, so in our After Effects project window, as well as the imports that we just looked at, you'll also see that I actually have the existing neon flicker text example, the one that I used for the title sequence. And these are the steps that we're going to be going through. You can see how by labeling them step 1, step 2 accordingly, everything's in order, and we can clearly see what the project is doing. And I'm going to recreate these steps as well as jumping back and forth into the finished version. The first thing we have to do is start with our basic layout. And so I'm going to create a new composition. I'm working at 1280 by 720, and I'm just going to call this step 01 to keep things clear. And then we're going to call this our source text. And as I said, I'm using a font called Roadhouse Neon. So I'm going to use, and let's just type in some neon text to be revealed. So now we can just lay out our text as we would like any other After Effects composition. It doesn't matter that all of the text is one layer. It's just a matter of going there and getting the size right to match your design and layout. Now, I like to keep the source text in its own comp just as a record of what I've done. This can also help if you're doing this for a commercial project. It can also help if you have to go back and say, for example, fix up typos. Maybe you've got someone's name wrong, etc., etc. So I'm actually going to leave this as a record and simply call that step 1. And now I'm going to duplicate this comp. And it's no longer step 1, it's now step 2, and I'm going to convert the text to masks. So all I have to do here is click on the text layer. I'm right clicking. I'm going to create masks from text. Now, as I said, the script, the masks to crop layers script, was originally designed to work with Illustrator artwork that had been pasted into After Effects. But After Effects will natively convert text into masks, and that's what I'm going to be using for this example. Now that we have our font as a bunch of masks, which is what our script works for, we can actually go and open up our masks to crop layers script panel. I've docked it here. Well, actually, you can see it's we don't need our paragraph. I'm going to close that. Here is the script. These are all default settings, and we can just click crop to layers. I mentioned earlier how the script has got two functions. One is to work with layers for animation, and the other is to pre-compose for performance. We're only going to worry about the masks to separate layers. And the only issue you might want to look at, if you're working with a really big comp and you want lots of glow, you may want to add a little bit more border padding so that the blurs and the glows don't clip. But at the moment, I am just going to keep everything at the default values, and I'm going to hit the crop to layers button. Oh, whoops, I have to select my layer. And you can see, okay, it's also worth noting that we have 34 masks. And if we expand the composition window, you'll now see that we have each individual segment of neon is now on its own layer, and you'll also notice that each layer is only as big as it needs to be. That's what the script does. So we're going to leave this here, and as I said, it's always good to have a record of the stages that we went through. So I'm going to leave this comp as it is, and I'm now going to duplicate it and work from a duplicate. Now, if we have a look at the template which I already created, you can see that I've got a step 3, and this is called our off state. So what I want is a base sort of look of the neon that looks like a neon tube that's been turned off. And so what I'm going to do is drag the source text into a new comp, and I'm going to call this off state just so I can remember what I've done. Up here. Okay, so here's my text, and I'm going to, in this case, I think I'm just going to fill it with a gray color. So I'm going to generate fill. I'm just going to go for a dark gray. Yes. And then I think I'm going to use layer styles, and then and we're going to look maybe just like a bevel and emboss, and see if we can get this looking a bit like a tube. And there we go. Now I'm going to jump ahead and look at the other offstate that I actually did, and I'm going to expand this. And if I go hit the Uber key, you can see that I've also added a small choke just to bring it, because I thought that the Roadhouse neon font was a bit thick. So what I'll do is I'll get this version, and I'm going to turn the layer styles off by turning off this, and we can just see that this is our source text, and you can see that I've choked it a little bit just to make it a bit smaller to help make it look more like a neon tube rather than a font, and then I've just filled it with grey, and that's as far as the effects go. And then in terms of layer styles, I've just used the bevel and emboss, and I've made the highlight a different color than white. So if I turn that bevel on, the idea is just to add a little bit of definition and make it look a little 3D. And I could play around with the angles and so on if I wanted to, but I don't want to spend too much time on this. So this is what we call our off state. This is sort of like the lights are there, but they haven't been turned on. So the next step is to get to our flickering animation, and this is where we jump out of the world of compositions and effects and into expressions. Our expression is going to be applied to each individual segment of the neon, and so to do that we're going to take all of our individual masks and work with those. But as I said earlier, I like to keep the stages of development that I went through there in the comp. So I'm going to take those masks that we already did, I'm going to duplicate that comp, and that's going to be now our step 4. So I'll type step 4, and this is actually going to be our flicker on animation. So I'll just name it flicker on animation. And when I open this up, we can see that it's got all of our crop masks there. And I'm actually just going to delete the original text layers because I don't need them. Now, writing expressions and talking about JavaScript isn't exactly everyone's idea of fun. So I've decided to keep the expression design part as a separate tutorial. If you're interested in writing expressions and you want to know the history or the background behind this neon flicker code, you can look out for an additional tutorial which will be coming soon. So now we have the final version of our expression pasted to all of our mask layers. We can just tweak a few of the controls and settings to suit our animation. So if I just hit spacebar to get a basic preview, see it's previewing in real time, let's have a look at what our options are. So the first thing we can do is choose the duration. How many frames do we actually want all of the text to be revealed at? Because obviously the neon is all flickering on. 50 frames at 25 frames per second is like 2 seconds, but we could make it slower. So let's type in 100 and we can see obviously everything's happening a lot slower. The gag's getting a bit thin. Let's try 75. That was 3 seconds. I still think it's a bit slow. We'll try 60. Okay. The next thing, after having setting the duration of our reveal, so by the time we get to frame 60, all of our letters are revealed. We can stagger the delay if we want to kind of emphasize, say, a subliminal sort of reveal. So if I put that at 0, there's no index delay. All the letters are flickering on equally together. Whereas if I put that a 1 frame delay, it means every layer order is being delayed by 1 frame. Now you can see at the moment it's going backwards. We're getting our last letter there first. So to fix that, all we have to do is select and copy and paste from the bottom up. So I'm going to select layer 1. I'm selecting from the bottom to the top. Then I'm going to cut, and then I'm going to paste. And now you'll see it's pasted them in reverse order. Let's drag that down there. So now when we hit play, we're subliminally getting the text from left to right. Now I can move that up to like 3 frames, but you'll see that there's not, and this is going to definitely emphasize it, but you'll see that the duration of our overall effect isn't long enough. So by the time we get to frame 60, all of a sudden all of our letters are on. So what I can do is I'm going to go to the frame before 60, 59. I'm just going to tweak this until we get a number where we can see just about everything. So if we go about 1.5, so 1.5 means that our letters will go on from sort of left to right by the time, and they're all on by the time we get to frame 60. Okay, so they're all revealed at frame 60. That's when we actually get to see our entire sentence. The next setting is, okay, how many frames after that do they do a couple of extra flickers? And at the moment it's set to 20. So if we turn all of these off, I'm just going to go 0, 0, and 0. Once we get to frame 60, that's it, they're on. Okay, so nothing happens. We get to frame 60, and for all intents and purposes, it's a static frame. Okay, but let's say we want to say for the next 20 frames, there might be some that do a little extra flicker. Then we have the probability. What's the probability of each individual layer continuing to flicker? Now, if we make that 100%, then 100% of these layers will flicker after they are revealed. That looks a bit silly. It looks a bit carnival. But we only want a few of them to continue to flicker. So what if we make that 10% probability? Means once we get to frame 60, 10% of them will just do a little bit of an extra flicker. We've got about 30 layers, so 10% of 30 should be 3. At the moment we're only getting 1, so maybe we can make that a bit higher, like a 20% probability. Okay, so now you can see that once they're all on, we've got a few layers just doing a little bit of an extra flicker. Okay. The next step we say, well, what percentage, how probable is it that an individual segment is going to be faulty? So we do the same thing. At the moment it's 0. If we put it at 100%, they'll all be faulty. Which is going to not look quite right. So let's try We only want a few, so I'm going to try 5%, which at the moment looks like so at the moment our letter E is faulty, and it's on. And if we want more faults, we can just scrub more. So if we go up to here, if I make it 9%, okay, if we have a 9% probability of a faulty letter, then this will give us this. We'll finally end up with this animation. And I think I'm going to leave it like this. I think this will be a good enough example to work with. So this is now our basic composition that has our flickering text animation. Now the next step is to move away from the expressions and into the actual compositing. We want to make this look like neon. The first thing I should probably add is that I'm working in 32-bit mode just because I'm used to it. That's what I would normally work in. Although that should normally be Rec 709. I'll make that. So these are the standard project settings where I would normally work: 32-bit floating point, Rec 709, and a linear working space. I understand that most of the motion designers watching this will either have color management off, or they'll be working in maybe 8 or 16 bits. You're more than welcome to follow along and change your projects to 8 or 16-bit as you see fit. Some of the effects and the glow settings will just be a little bit different. One of the advantages of working in 32-bit mode is that it retains highlight values, so you can actually make things brighter than white. And because neon is a light, we are basically emulating a lighting effect. The effects, the blur and glow effects, are going to give me a more realistic look than they would if I was working in 8 or 16-bit mode. So you can definitely create blurs and glows and neon effects in 8-bit mode or 16-bit mode. You're just going to have to tweak your own glow settings accordingly. Now that we have our composition that has our lights flickering on, what I will need a bit later on, and I'm sort of jumping a step ahead, I want a matte just for the faulty lights. One of the keys to making the neon look sort of a bit realistic is to have interaction between the letters, the foreground, the background, our fog and our off tubes. And to do that, I don't want the faulty lights sort of emitting lights, and I might want to matte them out later on. So to do that, I'm just going to drag our flicker on animation into a new comp, and I'm just going to scrub in a timeline here, and I'm going to call this faulty. It's step 5, so we're now up to step 5. I'm going to call this faulty light matte. Now when we look at the composition window, the faulty tubes look darker. However, they're actually not. This is an illusion. The flickering is applied to the opacity of the layer. So if we look at these on a transparent background, the faulty lights are actually more transparent. And what I want to do is convert the transparency. I want to convert this into a luma matte. I actually want a matte that only shows me the faulty tubes. So I'm just going to do a few little channel operations to shift things around and help that. The first thing I think I'll probably do is use the channel combiner. So the channel combiner effect is just going to give me a quick way to copy the channels around, because currently if I just turn this off, all of the color channels are the same. If I look at red, green and blue, they're all the same because they're white. The text was white. So the color channels are white. It's the alpha channel that's different. I want to swap that around. So I'm going to use the channel combiner plugin. I'm going to copy the alpha channel into the lightness of the layers. Now I'm just going to jump forward into the other version and copy the effects from there, and then I'll step through them and show you what I have done. There are probably several ways of doing this, but at the same time I'll just sort of show you the logic that I went through. So the channel combiner plugin, as I just sort of demonstrated, is copying the alpha channel into the RGB channels. And once we've done that, we actually want then a solid alpha channel. So I'm using the solid composite plugin to composite this against white. And you now see that we've got a little bit of differentiation between the faulty lights and the normal lights. So I'm going to emphasize that. And you also see that we're picking up dark edges. So I'm going to use the Minimax plugin to clean up some of those edges. And if I zoom right in, you'll be able to see the Minimax plugin. And what it's doing is it's looking for pixels in a 1 pixel radius, and it's just making everything maximum, which in our case maximum means white. So it's just cleaning up some of those edges. And then what I'm doing is I'm really crunching these levels because I want everything to be white, but I want our faulty tubes to be black. So when I turn the levels effect on, you'll see that by really crunching these values here, I've emphasized that. But you'll also see that by doing that, they've gone a bit sort of ragged. They're a bit jaggedy. So the next step is to use another minimax filter to make them bigger. And then I'm going to blur it a little bit. And then I'm actually adding just a very small amount of noise. So we now have a matte of our faulty lights. And all of this is what we will call procedural. It means that I haven't manually copied or pasted any of those masks. It means I'm using effects to do a procedural process and create this matte from our source animation. So if I go back to our source animation and I change our settings, and let's say I want 56, 84% of the tubes to be faulty, I can now go back to our faulty light matte, and you'll now see that I've got a matte accordingly showing all these different faulty tubes. You'll also notice how they flicker on and off as the faulty tubes flicker on and off. So if I go back here and put that back to 9, you'll go back on and see that we've got our matte here, and it flickers on and off as the faulty tubes do. Now, because our original flicker animation, the one that's generated by expressions, is changing the opacity of the layer, we're also going to create a version of this where the faulty lights are matted out. And this is going to be useful later on when we're starting to do blurs and glows, because we don't want our faulty lights to glow. So what I'm going to do is drag our flicker animation into a new comp, and I'm just going to rename this. It's now up to step 6. And I'm going to call this our flicker on with faulty lights. It's going to be a very simple comp. I'm just going to take the animation we have here. I'm going to bring our faulty light matte down that we just made, and I'm just going to make that a Luma track matte. Very, very simple. That's all there is to it. So now what we have is that our faulty tubes have been darkened considerably, and that means they won't be picked up by the blur and glow plugins that we're going to use to make our text look like neon. So the next step, if we jump down to our other template and see what we've done, now that we've actually got our faulty lights matte, we've got a flicker on with faults, we're actually going to make the text look like neon. Now to do this, I'm going to jump into the other template that I made. Now this is where the project is going to look quite different if you're working in 8 or 16-bit mode. But I'm going to jump down to the end, and firstly I'll just show you the layers. So we've got a few layers here, and I'm going to step through and show you what I've done. So I'm going to turn them off. Now firstly, I put a black background there, and I'll also let you know that any yellow layers are adjustment layers. And here you can see our actual neon text layers. This is the flicker on with faults. Now the first thing that we need to do is we want to build in a bit of flexibility into our template so that we can make changes easily. And one of the basic things we're going to be doing is choosing the color of our text. Now our original flicker on animation was just built up from masks on a white solid, and now we can use the tint plugin to tint that to whatever color that we'd like. However, to keep things flexible, we're going to link everything to one master control. Now, if I leap forwards a little bit and have a look at our final comp, you'll see that right up the top, I've got a null object called color settings. And if I press E, you'll see that I've applied two effects. These are what we call expression controls. So I've gone to expression controls and color control. And I've renamed these. You can say I've renamed one tint white and tint black. And what this does is every single time I use the tint effect to change the color of something, they're all linked back to these settings with a pick whip. It means I can change everything together. So skipping back to our color and glow comp here, this is where we're going to work with the text all by itself. But those tint effects, and if I just expand this and press EE to show expressions, you'll see that those black and white values have been linked just with the pick whip to those controls in our main comp. And you can see that for some reason I've chosen a light blue and a much darker version to tint to our black and white values. And all of these values, every time you see a tint effect, it's linked to those same values. This is where I've just built up some blurs and glows. So if I turn all of these off, you'll see that's our actual source layer. I've tinted it. I've used the exposure plugin to make it hotter. Remembering that in 32-bit mode you can make things whiter than white, and then I've just blurred it, and you can see that for this base layer where I just want like a big foggy fall off, it's a 32 pixel blur. I could make that more or less, but in this particular case I'll keep that at 32 pixels. Now I've done exactly the same thing. That's a duplicate of this layer, except this time it's only a 3 pixel blur, and these layers are being added on top of each other. So I sort of have a blurry fall off, a blurry sort of fall off again. Again, we've got another version of the layer. This time I've also added the choker effect. So once again, I've looked at the original source font and I thought the font is too chunky. It doesn't really look that realistic. And by using the simple choker effect, I can make that look more like an actual neon tube. Okay, so at the moment I'm just using a 1 pixel choke, and then I'm still tinting that, and this time I do have some blur on it, but it's only a 0.2 pixel blur. And again, that's being added on top of these. Now if I zoom right in, you can see the effect of that blur, and even now maybe I'm thinking that blur is slightly too strong. I might just make that 0.15. The reason I actually want blur is because I'm working in 32-bit mode, and I'm actually spreading these lighting values out. This is like light fall off. Now on top of this, we then have a version that's adding a hot inside, and this is something that you can adjust on a case by case. It will depend what color your text is as to how effective this is. Maybe that was why that was 0.25. Okay, so in this particular in this example, this particular layer, there's no tint, it's just white, and you can see that I've choked it more than the last one. The last one had a 1 pixel choke, this one's got a 2 pixel choke, so it's really like the inside of the tube, and I've made that hotter, increase the exposure. And so when I zoom in, you'll see that this is like creating the core, the inside core of the text. Now, as I said, how hot you want this to look will depend on the color that you choose. And this is working okay for this blue. If you wanted a little bit more color in here, what you could potentially do is I'm going to copy that tint effect that has the link to the global expression. And you can see how we've lost the hotness. But what I'm going to do is I'm not going to tint it 100%. Maybe only tint it, let's say 5. So this is like a 25% tint. But you can see that I can scrub the tint amount depending on how hot and how white I want the inside. And if I don't want the inside of the neon text to be completely white, I can just bring that tint back. I might just do, say, only a 10% tint. But it's up to your taste. Now, what I've also done to help prevent blurs and glows from spilling out, I'm bringing back these faulty tubes that we did earlier. So what I've got is our matte there, and I've just set this on top to multiply. And you can see how this is knocking out where those faulty tubes would be. Okay, and on top of that, now I've just played with a few blurs and glows. Now I'm using the standard After Effects glow plugin. There's quite a lot of third-party glow plugins that will do a more realistic light fall off, that can add all sorts of beautiful effects. If you've got them, great. In this particular case, I'm just sticking with the After Effects glow effect. So I'm going to turn on a glow there. What I'm doing here is I've also got a layer that's blurring it, just to keep the edges soft. I don't want any aliasing. Now, because I'm working in 32-bit mode, I've now got high dynamic range recovery. What I'm going to do is get the info window up just so I can show you the values. If I look over here and run my mouse over, anything over 1 is brighter than white. So you can see here that my green and blue channels are both well over 1. And in fact, maybe a better way of doing this as a difference to 8-bit color is to use 8-bit values. So in 8-bit world, obviously white is 255, 255, 255. And if I run the mouse over here, you'll see that those values are like the green channel is 453 and the blue channel is actually 569. So these colors here, wherever I run my mouse over, are whiter than white. Now what I want to do is just bring back a little bit of that detail. Now exactly how hot these are is going to depend on the color that you choose, because as I said, everything is linked to one color control. You can change your color just by clicking in the color slider, and some colors will respond to blurs and glows differently. So in this particular case, we've got a plugin called High Dynamic Range Highlight Compression. I'm going to turn that on, and you'll see that we're bringing all of those color values back down. We're getting a bit more detail back in here. Once I've done that, and it's not 100%, the setting is 65. So if I have that 0, then everything is white hot. And if I put that at 100% value, then there's no whiteness left. So what I'm really doing with this slider is adjusting how white hot I want the center of the neon tubes. And if I want a little bit of hotness, I can go at higher value. If I want a lot of like bright white hotness, then I'll leave it at a lower number. And at the moment, I'll just stick with what I had, which was 65%. Now, once I've tamed some of those over bright values, I'm just going to add a little bit more glow. And what I also want to do is add a little bit of contrast for when we have the flickering lights. So I'm using my flicker on, my original source animation here, and now I'm just using it as an overlay mode. It's going to bring a little bit of sharpness and hotness back. And then now that my high dynamic range values are still up there, I'm just doing another little bit of control. This is the area where I'm working in 32-bit mode and I'm playing around with colors and glows using After Effects tools. If you have your own third-party glow plugins, then you can work in 8 or 16-bit mode and just really play around to your heart's content. It's not that difficult to add a little bit of blur and glow. So when I go back to the start of my comp and I have a look through, I'm just going to do a RAM preview. As the lights come on, they're all nice and blurry, and they definitely look more like neon than our source layers with all those masks. Now there's going to be many instances where this might be good enough. You've got sort of like a text flicker animation on a plain black background, and it's you can play around with your own blurs and glows and colors, and that will be fine. What I'd like to do is just add a few more layers to this, a few more elements to help it feel a little bit more realistic. And I'm going to introduce a few compositing techniques to what I guess many people would consider motion graphics design. So the first thing I want to do is add a background image, and then I want to add a little bit of interaction between the light. I'm going to add some fog as well, some atmosphere, just to kind of help it feel like it's moving. And to do that, I want to have some sort of matte that represents the glow and the light that's coming off this neon. So I'm going to use our earlier sort of flicker on pre-comp, and I'm just going to blur the hell out of it to create a few mattes. And I'm going to create different levels of fall off. So in the same way, if we look at our color version here, you'll see how I've got like a very blurry version, a version that's blurry, a little bit more blurry, and then I've got two sharper layers that actually bring out the definition. I'm going to do the same thing to build up a matte that doesn't have all of the color and the glow in it. You can see here, if I look at the template I've already created, I created 3 versions of a matte, big, medium, and small. You can see that I've labeled them accordingly. So we're up to step 8, but we're also got 3 versions of step 8, A, B, and C. If I open up the large matte, the big matte, you can see what it looks like here. It's basically going to be a luma matte for lighting influence. I might step through it at the start. And I'll just take you through the layers down here and show you what's going on. So we start off with our original flicker animation. You can see that we're using our pre-comp, our flicker on with faults. We want the faulty lights off, and that's why we're using the faults. We don't want faulty lights to influence the glow and the interaction of the light with the background. That's why we're using that version of the animation. And you can see that all I've really done is just blurred it. That's a really big blur, 128 pixels blur. Then I've staggered another one on top that's got half the blur again, 64 pixels of blur. And then in this one, I've got half again, a 32 pixel blur. They're duplicates of the layer, they're the same thing. Once I've got this blurry version of the letters that flicker on, I want to punch out the original lights because I don't want the original lights to get too bright. So all I've done is taken the original flicker animation, and this time I filled it in with black. And I've done the same thing here. I've got two versions, one version that's a little bit blurry and then one version that's not. And they're just going to stop the areas with the lights from getting too bright later on. I guess you call them a holdout. You'll also see on the top that I've got a adjustment layer with the echo effect on it. Just ignore that for the moment. We'll come back to the echo in a minute. So when I look at this, I've now got three mattes. I've got the big matte, which is very, very blurry. And then I've got the same thing. It's actually a duplicate of that. I've just cranked down the blur versions. So in this particular case, the first blur is 26 pixels and this blur is 10. And it's otherwise identical to the other comp. It just doesn't have as many layers and it's not as blurry. So if we look at, let's choose a frame. If we choose frame 12, you can see this is our big fall off matte, and on here you can see this is our medium. See, just step between them. Now, in addition to these fairly large and fairly soft mattes, I was also thinking, wouldn't it, be kind of cool to build in the option of having something that's a little bit more stylized? I was thinking of like Kylo Ren's sort of grungy lightsaber look. So what I have done is created another version of a matte which I've called a small, and this is only for to add just a little bit of movement to the outside edges of the neon tubes. And this one's been done in a little bit of a different manner. So what I've done is I've started with the same layer, the flicker on with fault layer as our source, and I'll just turn it through. Firstly, I've used the levels effect to crunch down the faulty tubes. You can see here is, if I zoom in, this is our faulty tube, and I don't want that at all, so I've just used the levels effect to crunch the blacks. And now I'm using the roughen edges effect, and I've chosen the spiky look. And if I just hit spacebar to preview a few areas, you can see that we're getting a little bit of movement, a little bit of hairy edges around the edge. That's with a bit of evolution. And then what I'm doing is I'm using the set matte effect to matte out the original layer without the effects. So when I turn that on, it kind of knocks out the inside. And it just means that we don't have all of our sort of furry Kylo Ren edges inside the tube. We only want them on the edge. And then on top of that, I'm doing exactly what I did in the other two comps. I'm using a version that's been filled in with black and multiplied just to knock out the center again. And then we've got the echo effect. But as I said, pretend you haven't seen that. Well, actually, it is probably time to talk about the echo effect. So this composition, or I should say our final composition, is a 25 frames per second comp. But the animation itself, if we look at our flicker animation, go back to our expressions, it does look a bit sort of harsh. The flickering isn't 100% realistic. It just feels like it's a little bit too sharp. We're going to use the echo effect just to add a little bit of decay to the lights. So I've taken the color and glow composition and I've just dragged that into a new composition, and this has nothing at all applied to it except the echo effect. So I'm going to turn it off just so you can see it. I'm just going to zoom out so we can actually see our text. So if we look at it without the effect, you can see that some of these letters are only on for like one frame. That's where we're getting our flicker from. Our neon flicker is coming from these lights, but they're only lasting for one frame. I'm going to add another 2 frames that are decaying. So I'm going to turn on the echo effect, and you can see if I step through it now, you'll see that they kind of fade down. And as the lights fade down, it just smooths out the whole animation. We still get a twinkling light. Now, the echo effect that I'm using the echo operator to add, and this is actually adding 2 layers on top of each other. It's sort of like increasing the exposure of this layer. Again, this is because I'm working in 32-bit mode. If you're working in 8 or 16-bit mode, the effect won't be quite as strong. And you can play around with the decay settings, or you might prefer to work with the maximum setting instead, which won't clip the white values. So will clip the white values. I'm going to keep working in add because I want the fall off and the hot whites. So the echo effect is smoothing out our lights. However, now that we've smoothed out our flickering animation, we need to make sure that our light matte, our fog fall-off mattes match. So that's why inside these matte compositions, I have added the effect, but in this case, really just to avoid more pre-comps, I'm just using the echo effect on an adjustment layer. So you can see as I step through here frame by frame, the light fall off is matching our effect with the color. So now we have all of our ingredients in place, it's time to build up our final composition. So I'll open up the final composition, which is called Final Comp. And I will just expand this and I'll turn all these layers off and we can have a look at what's going on. So it's very easy when you have nothing but a black background. You'll also see that when I bring in mattes, this is another project organizational thing. When I bring in matte layers that are never going to be seen, I always have them at the bottom of the comp, and I always change the label color to none to indicate that they're not being turned on. I've created other tutorials about the way I composite, and the bottom line is that I don't use track mattes. I avoid them unless I really need to use them. I don't like having a composite where some layers are on and some layers are off. And wherever I can, I use the set matte effect and I put the mattes down the bottom, and that way when I open up a composition, I know that I can just go like that and turn every single layer on, and that's how it's meant to look. Now, as mentioned earlier, I also have a null object up here with our color settings on, and these are the colors that will control the tint effect wherever that is used. So what's involved in setting up our final composition? First of all, I'm just going to scrub down a little bit after all of the layers have been revealed. And you'll see that here is our actual text layer, our plain text layer that we had before with our echo effect. And all I've really done in this is just adjust the exposure effect. The color that you choose will affect how the echo effect and how all of the blurs and glows affect the final look. And so as we move between different colors, you kind of want this one overall control just to match it. So just to demonstrate, for example, if I want to change this from blue to say a dull, maybe a purple, you'll see that that's a very different look, very different amount of glow. And in this particular case, I may not want to pull the exposure down. But if I just go undo, and go back to where it was, this is very bright, and so that's why I've used the exposure effect just to pull it down. It's sort of like something you'd use in conjunction with changing the color settings. Now the main reason that I wanted to have sort of like a final comp was to bring in our background layer. So I'm going to turn this off and look at our background layer, and here is just an image I found off the internet. It's just a brick wall. And you can see that I've darkened it down to taste because we want this brick wall to we don't want it to dominate the neon effect. And in addition to having the brick wall down here as our sort of a solid background, I've also got our off state. Now, if you remember, so if we look at this, we created this earlier using layer styles, and this is just adding a little bit of emboss just to kind of create the illusion. It's kind of to give the impression that the lights are coming out of something. Now, if I go back and say, what I've also done is duplicated this and added a little bit of separation. So you can see that it's like a fake drop shadow. I've just multiplied a black version. I filled this in with black, and I've blurred it a little bit. If you wanted a stronger drop shadow, you could either use a shadow effect or just duplicate it again. That will give us a little bit of separation and just sort of help sell the overall effect. So now we've added additional elements to our scene. What we need to do is get a little bit of interaction with our light, because if we turn our light on, I mean, we're really just sticking our neon animation on top of a background layer, but we're not getting any additional level of realism. So if I jump to, let's choose a frame here where some lights are on and some lights are off, we're going to use those mattes that we created earlier. So if we have a look at this frame, I'm just going to snapshot our text, and now I'm going to compare that to our mattes that are down here. So here is so just switching back and forth, you can see that we have a fall off matte that's very big. We have a fall off matte that's medium, and then we have our sort of Kylo Ren edges. I'll just zoom out. And we're going to use these mattes to create sort of an interaction with our background layers. I'll use the brick version first. So I'm going to solo this. So what I've done is I've duplicated our background layer and I've added a few effects. So the first thing I've done is I've tinted our background layer that's linked to our main color settings. Everything is. So if I change this to red, our background will also be red. I'll cancel that. In addition to tinting it, I have crunched it down because we don't want it to be that light. And now this is where I've used the set matte effect and I've linked it down the bottom to our big fog matte. So as I just scrub through the timeline, you can see that as those letters are flickering on, they're introducing a little bit of color into our background plate, and then that is being added on to our original. Now I've done exactly the same thing. I've duplicated that layer, but I've used the medium matte. So you can see that this matte is much more tighter. And if I solo all of these layers together, as I play through this, you'll see sort of like the impression that light is influencing the background wall as the neon tubes come on. And as the faulty lights flicker on and off, so does the influence on the back wall. Exactly the same sort of thing has been done with the off state. So if I look at I'll turn this off. So here's the original off state, but what I've done again is created a duplicate, and I've done exactly the same thing. I have the tint effect applied that's linked so that the colors always match. I've used the exposure effect to make it a little bit brighter. And then once again, I've used the set matte effect so that we get this interaction as the lights come on and off. So if and then I've just added that on top of the original. So turning that on and just playing through this, you'll see these are our off tubes, and as the lights come on, the area around picks up a little bit of colored light influence. So if I turn on all of these sort of background layers from the bottom up, you'll be able to see what's going on. We've got our wall and our off-state tubes, and they're both sort of showing a degree of interaction as the lights come on. The next thing that I wanted to introduce was movement, and the reason I did this because I'd used a project with neon lights, but once all the lights were on, it just felt like nothing was actually happening. It felt like we were looking at a still frame. So one of the ways of introducing a bit of movement into that was to add a little bit of atmosphere. So exactly the same thing that you've seen me do with the background and the offstate, I've done with our atmosphere. And I'll turn these layers off. I've got 3 copies of atmosphere because I've created 3 different mattes. So every atmosphere layer corresponds to one of these mattes. And you can see how I've used layer markers here to actually remind me what these layers are doing. So if I just look at this layer by itself and turn off all of the effects, this is our original layer. As I said, it's from Action Essentials. It's been slowed down. And the first thing I've done, as in all of the other background layers, is I've tinted it. So you can see it's picking up the colors that I've chosen in the main comp. And then I've also used the exposure plugin just to add a little bit of contrast. And now I'm using the matte effect. Now I'm using the set matte effect twice. The first thing I'm doing is actually just getting our matte from down the bottom. So this is our big sort of light fall off. So if I go back to where the lights are coming on, you'll see that as the lights flicker on, they're kind of casting this light over the fog. And then I've adjusted the levels here to make the fog a little bit more prominent. And in this particular case, the reason I've got the exposure and the levels effect is because the levels effect, I'm adjusting the transparency. I'm actually adjusting how visible the fog is, because the fog now has an alpha channel. And what I'm doing is manually tweaking that alpha channel to adjust how much of the information is actually visible. And then finally, I'm using the matte effect to knock out the original text. So the second set matte effect is actually looking at the neon light, and it's an invert matte. So anywhere where the neon tubes are on, the fog is not. I don't want the fog on top of the tubes, I just want it around it. You can see the effect that that second effect has. So that's our big atmosphere. I've done exactly the same thing. It's a duplicate of the layer. The only difference is that I'm pointing it to a different fall off. Otherwise it's an identical layer. And finally, a similar thing with our sort of our Kylo Ren grungy area. Exactly the same effects stack. It's exactly the same thing going on. The only difference is which matte I'm pointing it to. This one's pointing it to as small. And if I change that to the big matte, then it would look exactly the same as the other one, although I probably tweaked the levels here. So now if we have a look at our 3 layers of interactive fog and lighting, as I step through them, you'll see that they're sort of flickering on, and as the lights come on, the degree of light and fog that we see matches accordingly. So if I just turn on everything except the actual text, you'll be able to see all of the elements that we've added to our background. So you'll see we've got our off state, we've got our tubes showing some light, we've got our light and color on our background wall, and we've got a little bit of fog showing up as the lights come on. So now that we have all of those elements in place, we can actually turn on the text. So this blue layer is our text layer. We're just going to add that on top. So as we step through it, we can see that everything's falling into place and it's starting to look quite good. There's just a couple other things to do. Now, firstly, changing the colors can have a really big effect on the overall look. And just to demonstrate it now that we've got a few more colors, I'll do what I did before and I'll change it from blue, and I'll just maybe go through what we did, like a dark purple before, and that looked pretty cool. The degree of glow and fall off and everything that you get will change and look quite different depending on how bright your colors are. So if you go for something yellow, for example, you can see that it's a very extreme example of brightness. We could try a dark green and so on. I'm just going to cancel that. But the point is that when you change the colors, you can change the way it looks. I want a little bit of control over the way that the faulty globes, the globes that are off, look. So what I've done is I've brought in that faulty matte layer again. Doesn't have any effects applied to it, but I'm just going to multiply that, or in this case linear burn it, on top of the original. And if I zoom in, you can just see what difference that makes. It's not making really that much difference in this instance, but as I change the colors, it gives me a little bit more control in case the faulty lights become a little bit too bright. The final thing that I'm going to do, now that I've got everything sort of working together, is just do a little bit of final blurs and glows, just to get that sort of neon interaction happening between everything. So before I start, again, I'm looking at highlight recovery. So if I run my mouse area over these white areas, you can see that they're quite hot. I'm looking up here in Info Palette. You can see that there's quite a bit of information that's all being clicked because of the values are over 255. So I'm just going to bring back a little bit of high dynamic range information. At the moment I've got it at 50%. And again, I will vary this a lot depending on the color that I choose. If I want more of a hot white inside, I'll put this at 0. And if I want more of a colored, I'll crank it up so we get our original color. And at the moment I'm going to leave that at 50%. Now I've just got a little contrast curve to just crunch the background. I've got a little bit of blur and glow. Again, you can play around with the degrees of blur and glow depending on the color that you're using and what sort of a look you want. Both of these are on adjustment layers, and I'm working up through my adjustment layers, and you can see that they're actually the settings are really low. So when I said I had a blurred layer, what I'm doing is I'm doing a small amount of blur, but I'm adding it on top of itself. If I crank it up to 100, you can see that that's having quite a big effect. And if I have that at 0, it doesn't. I'm just bringing a little bit in because I like a little bit of extra glow. Maybe I'll make that 15%. And then this is the After Effects Glow plugin. And once again, if you have your own third-party glow plugin, it will probably look better. And maybe I'll crank that up to 50. And then finally, as our very last stage, again, just a little bit of highlight recovery. And I'm going to keep that, maybe bring that right down to 10. This is only, these controls are all here in the main comp so that you can adjust them depending on the color that you choose. So if I toggle them off and on, I'm constantly asking myself, as I toggle them on, does it look better? It will vary according to the color that you've chosen. So now that we've got our final comp there, that's all done. And you can go through and experiment with different colors. If we want to go purple, pink. And the black doesn't make a huge difference, but it's there simply because the tint has a black and a white value. And there we go. So I'm going to leave you with that. So there we have it. That's our neon light reveal effect, and we've gone through all three stages. We've used the mask to crop layers script to separate text layers out into individual masks. We have written an expression that flickers our lights on like a neon light, and then we've composited the end result together. The masks to crop layers script can be found at AE Scripts and AE Plugins, along with a couple other scripts that I have available. I hope you found this tutorial interesting and useful, and please consider purchasing masks to crop layers too. Thanks very much. I'm Chris Swar.